Before her death, Maureen Cox revealed why she left Ringo Starr, and fans are still absorbing how different the truth was from the fairy tale they were shown. Maureen Cox and Ringo Starr once represented something rare in the chaos of Beatlemania: a young Liverpool woman and a rising drummer who believed love could survive fame. When they married in February 1965, the world saw stability, devotion, and a family forming in the middle of a cultural explosion. Photographs captured smiles, but photographs never showed the nights she spent alone, the weight of raising children while the noise grew louder, or the quiet fear that the man she loved was slipping away. For years, Maureen said almost nothing. She watched Ringo's struggles become public, while her own pain stayed private, carried without applause or sympathy. Only later, when time had taken its toll, and life had narrowed to what truly mattered, did she explain why she walked away. What she revealed was not anger or revenge, but a truth shaped by love, endurance, and loss. Before the world knew her name, Maureen Cox lived a life defined by ordinary rhythms and quiet certainty. She was born Mary Cox in August 4, 1946, in Liverpool, a city shaped by work, music, and close community. Long before screaming crowds and flashing cameras, she trained as a hairdresser, a job grounded in routine and conversation, where people shared their lives while she stood steady behind the chair. It was a life built on familiarity, not spectacle. Liverpool in the early 1960s was alive with music, but it was still small enough that paths crossed naturally. In 1962, Maureen met Ringo Starr at the Cavern Club. At that time, he was not yet a global symbol, just Richard Starkey, a drummer finding his place in a band that was beginning to outgrow its hometown. Their connection formed before the world claimed him, before the demands of fame rewrote the rules of intimacy. What drew her to him was not celebrity, because it had not arrived yet, but personality, humor, and a shared sense of belonging in a city that felt like home. As the Beatles' popularity surged, Maureen remained close, often present during those early years when the band was still accessible and human. She traveled with Ringo and was part of his private life, while the public narrative was still being written. By the time Beatlemania exploded, their relationship had already taken shape, rooted in familiarity rather than fantasy. That distinction mattered, even if the world never noticed. When Ringo proposed in January 20, 1965, at the Ad Lib Club in London, the moment carried the weight of both promise and pressure. Less than a month later, on February 11, 1965, they married at Caxton Hall Register Office. The ceremony was brief, but the attention was overwhelming. Photographers crowded the entrance, and fans pressed close, turning a personal milestone into a public event. From that day forward, Maureen's life was no longer her own in the way it once had been. Motherhood arrived quickly. Their first son, Zach, was born in September 13, 1965, followed by Jason in August 19, 1967, and Lee in November 11, 1970. While Ringo's career demanded constant movement, recording sessions, tours, and film work, Maureen became the center of a growing household. She carried the responsibility of stability, while the world associated her husband with constant motion. This imbalance was not dramatic or explosive at first. It was quiet, cumulative, and largely invisible. Despite the pressures, Maureen remained deeply involved in the Beatles' inner circle. She answered fan mail in the early years, participated in studio moments, and even appeared singing in the chorus of the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. These details, small as they may seem, reveal how close she stood to the creative heart of that era. She was not merely watching history happen, she was living inside it. Yet even then, the cost of fame was beginning to show. Beatlemania did not pause for family dinners or private conversations. It demanded constant access, constant energy, constant performance. Maureen's role became one of endurance, holding together a sense of home while the outside world pulled harder each year. She did not speak publicly about strain or sacrifice at the time. Silence was part of survival. A simple but essential truth emerges here. Maureen Cox did not fall in love with a legend. She loved a man before the legend existed, before fame rewrote his life and demanded space in their marriage. What remains unanswered is how long that kind of love can survive once the world refuses to leave it alone, and how much it asks of the person standing closest to it. As Ringo's fame accelerated, Maureen's identity began to shift in ways she never publicly asked for. She was no longer simply Mary from Liverpool, or a working hairdresser with her own routine and independence. She became Ringo's wife, a title that carried access but also erasure. Her presence was expected at certain moments and invisible at others, always defined by proximity to someone else's success. The early years of Beatlemania reshaped daily life with relentless force. Travel schedules changed without warning, privacy dissolved, and ordinary boundaries disappeared. Maureen moved through crowds that wanted something from her husband, and by extension from her. Fans waited outside homes, photographers followed movements, and even personal milestones became public property. This was not an adjustment she documented in interviews or diaries for the world to see. It was something she absorbed quietly, learning how to exist inside a life that no longer belonged fully to her. Despite the chaos, she remained deeply connected to the Beatles' inner world. Maureen was present in studios, around friends, and within moments that later became part of music history. She sang in the chorus of the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, a small contribution that symbolized how close she stood to the creative process. Paul McCartney's Thanks Mo, at the end of the Get Back recording, was casual, almost throwaway yet revealing. It showed that within the band's private language she mattered. These were not gestures staged for cameras. They were acknowledgments made when the world was not supposed to be listening. At home, responsibility settled unevenly. Raising 3 children, while married to a global figure, required emotional labor that rarely translated into public recognition. Zach, Jason, and Lee arrived within 5 years, each birth anchoring Maureen more firmly to domestic life, while Ringo's commitments pulled him outward. This contrast did not arrive as a single breaking point. It accumulated through missed routines, long absences, and the strain of maintaining normalcy inside an abnormal existence. What is important here is what Maureen did not do. She did not trade her private life for celebrity status. She did not publish tell-alls during the height of the Beatles' power. She did not position herself as a victim or a symbol. Her silence was not passivity. It was a choice shaped by loyalty, dignity, and the belief that marriage was something to be protected, even when it was difficult. By the late 1960s, the world around them had changed dramatically. The Beatles were no longer just a band. They were a cultural force under constant scrutiny. As tensions within the group became visible, the emotional weight inside their personal lives deepened as well. Maureen stood at the intersection of that pressure, balancing family, public expectation, and a relationship under strain. Yet she continued to show up, fulfilling roles that demanded steadiness when everything else felt unstable. This part of her life is often summarized too quickly, reduced to dates and associations. But it deserves attention for what it reveals about her character. Maureen Cox endured an extraordinary transformation without abandoning her sense of self. She remained grounded in ordinary values while living inside an extraordinary story. Before heartbreak, before separation, there was commitment. There was endurance shaped by daily responsibility and quiet resolve. There was a woman who entered fame without asking for it, and remained inside that world longer than many would have, not because it was easy, but because she believed in holding things together. Her strength did not announce itself. It showed up in routine, in loyalty, and in the decision to stay present when retreat would have been simpler. What lingers is not a question of whether she was capable of staying. She clearly was. The question that remains is how much of herself she gave in order to keep going, and how much of that cost went unseen for years. The end of the Beatles in 1970 did not bring relief into Maureen's life. It removed the structure that had held everything in place. For years, the band's schedule, pressure, and purpose had dictated the rhythm of their household. But once that ended, the silence left space for problems that could no longer be avoided. Ringo Starr struggled deeply after the breakup. Without the band, his sense of identity faltered, and alcohol became a constant presence in his life. This was not a hidden issue. His drinking escalated during the early 1970s, shaping his behavior and affecting everyone around him. Maureen later described how insecurity and low self-esteem followed him closely, and how he needed repeated reassurance that he was loved. These were not passing moods. They were patterns that settled into daily life. For Maureen, this period demanded a different kind of endurance. The man she had known before fame, before global attention, felt harder to reach. Alcohol changed conversations, altered moods, and drained emotional availability. Home no longer felt like a place of rest. It became a space of tension, unpredictability, and concern. She was raising 3 children, while navigating a marriage that felt increasingly fragile. What makes this chapter difficult to summarize is its quiet persistence. There was no single event that marked the decline. Instead, days blurred into each other under the weight of worry. Maureen remained present, attempting to keep stability intact for her children while watching the person she loved struggle with himself. She did not describe herself as heroic, and she did not dramatize her role. She simply stayed. Ringo's career continued, but without the Beatles, it lacked the anchor that had once surrounded him with structure and accountability. Success still existed, but it did not protect him from personal collapse. Alcohol followed him into work and into home life, eroding trust and connection. Maureen later acknowledged that his insecurity fed the cycle, a fear of not being enough once the band was gone. By this point, the marriage had shifted from partnership to survival. Emotional distance widened, and communication thinned. Maureen's loyalty did not disappear, but it was tested repeatedly. Loving someone through addiction demands patience that rarely receives recognition. It also carries a cost that accumulates slowly, often without witnesses. Publicly, little was said. Maureen did not step forward to explain what was happening behind closed doors. Her silence during these years was not ignorance. It was protection of her children, of her husband, and of a private life she still believed deserved boundaries. While Ringo's struggles became part of public record, her experience remained largely invisible. The emotional strain of this period reshaped the marriage. Alcohol did not exist in isolation. It affected trust, presence, and safety. It turned ordinary moments into uncertainties. Over time, the connection that once felt solid began to thin, stretched by exhaustion and disappointment. Maureen's strength during this phase was not loud. It was persistent, carried day after day without assurance that things would improve. A painful truth becomes clear. The end of the Beatles did not free the marriage. It exposed what fame had concealed for years, the fragility beneath the noise and success. What remains unanswered is how long love can survive when the person you are trying to hold onto is slowly slipping away from himself, and how much strength it takes to keep reaching when nothing is coming back. By the mid-1970s, the marriage had reached a point where strain could no longer be absorbed quietly. Alcohol had weakened the foundation, but infidelity delivered the final blow. What Maureen had endured privately now surfaced in ways that made continuation impossible. The relationship was no longer sustained by patience alone. Ringo Starr's affairs were not isolated incidents. Over time, they became part of the breakdown, compounding the instability that already existed. The most damaging was his involvement with American fashion model Nancy Lee Andrews. This relationship did not remain hidden, and its visibility added humiliation to heartbreak. For Maureen, betrayal was not only about trust being broken, it was about realizing that the effort to hold the marriage together was no longer mutual. The legal process reflected this reality. When the divorce was finalized on July 17, 1975, The grounds cited included Ringo's affair and the broader failure of the marriage. These were formal words for a deeply personal collapse. Behind them was a woman who had spent years trying to preserve a family while absorbing loss quietly. What is often misunderstood about this moment is Maureen's position. She did not rush toward separation. She did not seek escape at the first sign of damage. Accounts from the time indicate that she initially resisted divorce, hoping the marriage could still be repaired. This hesitation speaks to the depth of her commitment rather than weakness. Letting go required acknowledging that endurance alone could not repair what had been repeatedly broken. Complicating this chapter further was Maureen's own reported affair with George Harrison, Ringo's bandmate. This detail has often been sensationalized, stripped of context, and used to assign blame without understanding. What matters here is not comparison but consequence. The marriage had reached a state where boundaries had collapsed on all sides. Trust was fractured beyond repair, and the intimacy that once defined the relationship no longer existed in any stable form. By the time the separation became official, the emotional damage was already complete. Divorce did not end the pain, it confirmed it. For Maureen, this marked the loss of the life she had built since her late teens, the family structure she had protected, and the future she once believed could be restored. Public reaction focused largely on Ringo. His image, his struggles, and his next chapter dominated attention. Maureen stepped away from the spotlight almost entirely. There were no victory statements or public explanations. She chose distance, preserving what remained of her privacy and focusing on her children. A difficult truth comes into focus. Infidelity did not take root in a healthy marriage. It emerged in one already worn down by addiction, absence, and exhaustion. Maureen's decision to leave was not fueled by anger or revenge. It came from the recognition that staying no longer protected anyone, least of all herself. What remains unanswered at the end of this chapter in their lives is not who failed whom. It is whether love can survive when respect disappears, and what it costs to finally accept that walking away is not abandonment, but survival. Life after the divorce did not bring immediate peace. It brought distance, adjustment, and a reckoning with everything Maureen had carried for years. Away from the marriage, the weight she had held quietly did not vanish. It surfaced in ways that were painful and visible, reminding those closest to her that survival does not end when a relationship does. At one point after the separation, Maureen attempted to take her own life by riding a motorcycle into a brick wall. She survived. The incident was not framed by her as drama or spectacle, and it was not followed by public explanations. It stood as evidence of how deeply the collapse of her marriage had affected her, and how much had been held in without release. Recovery was slow and private, shaped by rebuilding rather than reinvention. Over time, Maureen found a different kind of stability. In 1989, she married Isaac Tegret, an American entrepreneur and co-founder of the Hard Rock Cafe and House of Blues. With him, she stepped further away from the world that had once defined her public identity. They had a daughter together, Augusta, adding a new chapter to her life rooted in maturity rather than youth. This period was quieter, less documented, and intentionally removed from the intensity of her past. Illness eventually reshaped everything again. Maureen was diagnosed with leukemia, a battle that unfolded away from headlines. As her health declined, old divisions softened. At the end of her life, those who mattered most gathered close. Ringo Starr, the man she had married decades earlier and divorced after years of pain, was there at her deathbed. So were her children, her mother, and her husband. The presence of all those lives in one room spoke to something beyond blame or resentment. Maureen died on December 30, 1994, in Seattle, Washington. She was 48 years old. In the aftermath, public attention briefly returned, not through scandal, but through remembrance. Paul McCartney later wrote the song, "Little Willow," dedicating it to her children, a gesture that reflected how deeply she had been woven into the Beatles' private world. even if history often placed her at the margins. Before her death, Maureen spoke openly, though rarely, about why her marriage ended. She did not reduce it to a single betrayal or a single flaw. She spoke about insecurity, alcohol, and emotional absence. She described a man who needed constant reassurance, and a marriage that slowly became unlivable, despite love still being present. Her words carried no bitterness, they carried clarity. What stands out most in her final reflections is restraint. She did not attempt to rewrite the past or claim moral victory. She acknowledged her own endurance and the limits of it. Leaving for her was not a rejection of love. It was an acceptance of reality. Resolution arrives without romance. Maureen Cox did not leave Ringo Starr to punish him or to escape fame. She left because staying meant losing herself completely. In the end, her truth was simple and devastating. Love can survive many things, but it cannot survive being asked to carry everything alone. Maureen Cox is often remembered as part of a larger story, a name attached to a legend, a footnote in the history of the Beatles, yet her life deserves to be understood on its own terms. She entered fame without seeking it, loved deeply without spectacle, and endured far longer than the world ever knew. Her silence was not weakness, it was dignity. What she revealed before her death was not meant to shock or accuse, it was meant to explain. Her marriage did not end because love vanished, but because carrying everything alone eventually became impossible. In that truth, there is something painfully familiar, especially for women whose labor and loyalty go unseen. Maureen's story reminds us that behind every public romance is a private cost, and behind every legend is someone who lived with the consequences. Her voice came late, but it came honestly, and it still matters. For more emotional stories, check out this video.